And welcome to a fully digital edition of Krown Gridiron Nation on tsn.ca and on YouTube. The soccer guys have kind of pushed us over to this space. I'll tell you about the spaces these guys are in. Deshaun is in Toronto with his full basketball collection behind him. So basketball still supports football in this country. And Gord is in beautiful downtown. We'll be specific this time. We usually say Vancouver, but he is in Langley, British Columbia. And now it's time for the three-minute offense.
Western hosting Laval in the Mitchell Bowl. The Rouge et Or lead this series 5-1. Opening stanza, it was a Ford assembly line. It was all Mustangs. Magna Jones from Hillock. Bowers Kane with a field goal recovery. Another field goal in the middle of that, and it's 17-0 after a quarter, 17-4 at the half. The R&O regrouped, and then they just kept chipping away. David Dallaire from 2 out, and then David Dallaire from 2 out, and just like that, Laval are up by 1. Western would reply with a field goal, but Laval responded with 3 field goals of their own, and the Rouge et Or spoiled the purple party this weekend. Uteck Bowl, the Saskatchewan Huskies at St. FX. Would the X-Men be the sacrificial lamb from the AUS? This game was tight. 6-6 at the half. Riker Frank would get the first major in the third, so cue the slaughter, right? X replied with their own tutty. Silas Banyan with a 19-yard sprint to the blue, and we are tied. But to beat the Green Dogs, X needed to be perfect, and that just wasn't in the cards. X gets respect. Sask gets the W. It's one of the better UTechs we've seen in the last 2 decades.
Well, that was kind of crazy, wasn't it? Both those games. You know, if X could have kept a clean sheet, they may have had a chance in that game against Saskatchewan on their home field. And at least in my opinion, taking a look at what Western did in that second half, it was slightly reminiscent of their meltdown against Laurier a few years back in the Yates Cup, where they abandoned everything that worked for them, Gord, and they ended up paying the price.
Yeah, I mean, well, we've talked about Western's attack all season long, and when we've talked about Western's attack, you know, we've mentioned Evan Hillock, the quarterback, a couple times on here, but that's not what we've been talking about when we've been talking about Western's offense. And so it did feel like they kind of abandoned their principles a little bit and got away from what was working for them. You know, they come out of this game with an even 50-50 run pass split, 31 pass attempts versus 31 rushing attempts. And that may sound pretty balanced, but the thing is for Western that, you know, you compare that to their previous 2 playoff games. Against Laurier, they ran the ball 68% of the time. Against Queens, they ran the ball 72% of the time. So that is not Western's bread and butter if they're asking Evan Hillock. Evan Hillock only passed 14 times in the Yates Cup. He passed 31 times against Laval. And ultimately, I think the takeaway a lot of people took from watching that was that if this falls on his shoulders, he's not at this point capable of doing that against a top tier defense and taking on the load himself. And so it was a little disappointing to watch them get away from it. And what was interesting is while they weren't experiencing their usual level of rushing success, they still were rushing all right. They were averaging just about 5 yards a carry even throughout the afternoon. And that is enough to be a sustainable rushing attack, though maybe not an exemplary one in the Canadian game. So that was a little bit disappointing for me.
I think the biggest thing that we have to look at with Western when it comes to the Mitchell Bowl is that they were missing their second string quarterback. Edouard Winati was their second string quarterback, but he was also half their running game. He was a top 5 rusher in the nation, rushing for 853 yards, 9 touchdowns. When it came to the end of the season, he was like the 3rd best running back in the OUA. So for him to not be available for that game, and for Keanu Yazbek to be entering that game with an injured shoulder, for the first time ever, we got to see Keon Edwards basically play 4 quarters of football, which is what we've never seen before in his career, considering in 2021, he was splitting carries with Trey Humes and Edouard Winati. And then this season, he was splitting carries with Edouard Winati and Keanu Yazbek, as well as Troy Thompson. So entering that game, we were going to see Keon Edwards play 4 full quarters, something we've never seen before. And for Laval, Alec Poirier, their linebacker, he was preparing for 3 different looks. So he was preparing for the Edouard Winati look, the Keon Edwards look, as well as the Keanu Yazbek look. Entering that game, Yazbek was hurt. and he only has to deal with Keon Edwards. So he only has one look to deal with. So I wasn't surprised to see Western's run game be limited in the Mitchell Bowl, because it was the first time we got to see Keon Edwards play 4 full quarters. Then
yeah, to your point there, yeah, like Evan Hillock ran a couple times himself. Yazbek, I think, only toted the rock twice in this game. And then on the other side, I should point out too, like we were talking about Arnaud Desjardins and Kevin Mittal as kind of the core of that Laval attack, but Laval rushed for well over 150 yards on the afternoon as well, and had I think it was 7.3 yards a carry throughout the afternoon. Now that's an exceptional rushing attack, and not necessarily something we were expecting coming in, was for Laval to really make hay on the ground in this game, and they were able to do so effectively. And I think the one thing we did talk about in last week's show that did come to pass, I'll have to point out, was I talked about how Laval is going to have to figure out a way to make game-changing splash plays, and I suggested maybe special teams was a place for that. Well, we saw that they did have a couple of those big game-changing, momentum-shifting plays on special teams, especially in the first half of this one, that really made a difference.
Yeah, those field goal blocks, some of the blocks on special teams, maybe a bit of a hint as what was going to come in the Grey Cup the next day, actually, when you take a look at things and break things down. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that to both Mike and yourself, Gord, that Western may have not have been tested as much as they should have been in the OUA season, and that if they were going to face some adversity in a game, how would they respond to it? That was the question that was going out there. Did we get our answer? Or, as Deshaun indicated, with some of those injuries to some of those running backs, was this maybe a little inevitable?
I think you touch on a little bit the double-edged sword of building your offense the way that Western has built their offense, in that running game can really bludgeon people to death as long as you get up and stay up. And unfortunately, it's the double-edged sword is that when you get behind and you feel like you're chasing the game a little bit, your tendency is to abandon that running game a little bit more, or logistically, it just doesn't make sense to use that running game. And so I think when we've seen Western slip up in the past handful of years, or get beaten, I should say, and maybe not fair to characterize it as slipping up every time, but when we've seen somebody go in and be able to beat them, it's usually been because that team has been able to establish a lead on Western and then force Western to chase the game and play catch up throughout the evening. And that was, Laval never really pulled ahead in this game, so to speak, but it did feel like, especially with those blocks you were talking about, it did feel like Western was kind of chasing the game throughout the day, and that's what led to them getting away from their bread and butter. But I don't know that this is something that we can necessarily make huge sweeping statements about Western based on. But I will say that I think it does shed the rest of the OUA in a little bit of a different light, in that, I think there was an assumption that the OUA was a fairly strong conference this year and Western was just that much stronger. And I would say that that's maybe not quite as clear now as it may have felt going into this game.
Deshaun, quickly, how many minutes did Western spend in their OUA season trailing in a game? It couldn't have been more than 15.
I mean, they only trailed 2 times the entire season, right?
Yeah.
Like since 2021, they've only trailed in twice throughout the entire 2-year span. But to Gore's point, I think we learned a lot about Evan Hillock, because we've never seen Evan Hillock have to take control of a game the way that he had to do in the Mitchell Bowl. Most times, he's been able to set up the pass through the run behind a solid run game that has elite depth. Without that elite depth, the run game breaks down, puts the ball in his hands. He has to win the game, and he wasn't able to do that. We saw him overthrow multiple receivers on multiple plays that could have been game-changing. We saw him underthrow receivers. We saw him miss reads, and ultimately he ran out of bounds on the final play of the game, right? So I think we learned a lot about Evan Hillock as a quarterback going forward, but I think we also learned a lot about what it takes to beat the Western Mustangs, right? Because at the end of the day, the key that we saw Laval take was, if you can load the box, tackle well, you can shut down that run game. And if you can put the ball in Evan Hillock's hands, then he can't save the Western Mustangs. So I think we learned a lot about what it takes to beat the Western Mustangs, and kind of like solve that code and solve that problem that a lot of OUA teams have been able to do over the last couple of years.
Now, switching gears to the Uteck Bowl, I'll admit something. Fumbling around on my phone on CBC Gem while in the middle of meetings at the Grey Cup, not ideal. Would have been nice to see that game on TV, especially with the game that X gave Saskatchewan It's one of those situations, even on their home field, they needed to have a clean sheet. They didn't necessarily have that clean sheet with about a 4-minute meltdown in that game. But what an opportunity for X to actually use that game, use their competitiveness as an opportunity to build some recruiting down east into Atlantic Canada. I think X, from what I saw this year and in that game, would be a good third place team, maybe pushing up against second in the Canada West this year, quite frankly. They were that good in every aspect of the game. Gord, what are your thoughts from what you saw of X and how this game may start to change some opinions about football in Atlantic Canada?
Yeah, well, I think you hit the nail on the head, Jim. I mean, I don't want to use this to make any sweeping statements about, the state of the AUS or anything like that. But I think, if there's a team that isn't going forward to the Vanier Cup that can feel pretty good about themselves on the whole, it's St. FX, who I think can walk away from this game and be honestly telling themselves that there were a couple of key turnovers, a late pick 6 in the fourth quarter from being right in this thing. Now the reality is that Saskatchewan outgained them on offense by by over 150 yards, so they weren't necessarily right there with Saskatchewan, but they were certainly competitive throughout most of the afternoon. And you talk about recruiting tips, I mean, the campus showed out too. Beautiful fall day in Antigonish. That's one of the prettiest campuses in the country when it's a nice day, which that's a pretty unfortunately is a pretty big asterisk when it's a nice day up there, but when it is, it's beautiful. It showed out really well, and X had a lot of pride to play for. Now I will say, like, that's a long trip for Saskatchewan. It's not an easy trip for Saskatchewan, but I think that's not really an excuse that bears a lot of attention to. I mean, home field advantage is home field advantage no matter where it is. Reality is Saskatchewan, I think, their talent base kind of took over the game late and made it clear that they probably were the better team of the two. But that being said, St. FX, it didn't feel like St. FX was just kind of hanging on for dear life throughout the afternoon. It did feel like they were genuinely standing there toe to toe with Saskatchewan for a good chunk of this game.
I think the reality is that game was victory for AUS culture. At the end of the day, I think a lot of people expected Saskatchewan to go in there and blow out St. FX like we've seen in recent years, considering we've seen AUS teams lose by 50, 60, in some cases 80 points in national semifinals. To see St. FX hang with Saskatchewan until the fourth quarter. At one point, it was 13-13 in the fourth quarter. To see that was simply impressive. What that means for St. FX itself as a program, it means that they're at a point now where they can use this to their advantage. And like you both said, recruit nationally, right? And I love to see now if they can do more in terms of attracting athletes from across the country to come out to an Atlantic school and say, like, hey, you can come to St. FX and possibly compete for a national championship, right? So my thing is, I love to see if they can tap into some of the powerhouse provinces such as Quebec, such as Saskatchewan, such as Ontario, bring in more recruits, build out that program. At the end of the day, you're looking at St. FX, they were a great team this year, right? 13 conference all-stars, almost every single major award winner. So it makes sense on paper to see that they were competitive in that game. But I think in terms of what this does for AUS culture, it kind of brings them out of the shadows a little bit. It kind of puts a little bit more respect on some of those schools, specifically St. FX being the school to stand above the rest. And hopefully we can be one step closer to one day seeing an AUS team break through to a Vanier Cup.
Okay, we talked a lot about X, but it was Saskatchewan that won this thing. Deshaun, what did you see out of the Huskies in this game, or what gave you pause for concern, especially in comparison to what we saw in the regular season from Saskatchewan?
I honestly don't think there was much that gave me pause for concern, because if you look at the Saskatchewan's 2022 regular season, they've battled all types of hurdles, all types of obstacles, whether it be trailing at halftime, going up against high-powered run games, high-powered passing games, stubborn defenses like the Regina Rams. They've seen a lot of obstacles, and they've been able to overcome a lot of obstacles. Now, last week I asked, what is it that St. FX could bring to the table that Saskatchewan hasn't seen? Saskatchewan turned the ball over 5 times. That's what they brought to the table. All right. So, but when looking at the Saskatchewan Huskies, nothing brought any concern to me. They're battle tested. They've seen every obstacle. This is a team they're probably one of the most, I guess, experienced 7-1 teams you'll ever see. A lot of undefeated 7-1 teams often have a perfect season, trample over everybody, fill the stat sheets. This is a team that's seen it all. They've seen every obstacle. And at the end of the day, they still put together a great game. Mason Nyes, arguably probably the Heck Crichton Award winner, had over 300 passing yards, did his job. Daniel Weeb, one of the second string receivers, stepped up, had over 100 rushing yards and receiving yards, and Riker Frank had over 100 rushing yards. So they still had a great game. They still played to their standards statistically, and they were once again able to overcome another obstacle.
I think they probably need to play a little bit better in the trenches this upcoming week than they did in Nova Scotia. And I also would say, like you alluded to it, they did not take good care of the ball in this game. And it did not necessarily feel like playoff style football. Because of that, they're going to have to be a lot tighter against the Laval squad that, is almost always extremely well coached and plays, minimal, almost mistake-free football. Saskatchewan can beat that team if they are going to stand with them and also play pretty close to mistake-free football. I don't think they can if they play with their food, because this week that food bites back a little bit harder. So I think that that's something that Saskatchewan needs to tighten up on moving forward. And as for Laval, the only thing that I would say is that they won this game in a very Quebec style to me, in that there was a lot of loving settling for 3 points, and I feel like whenever we watch the top end RSEQ games, you get into this mode where you're just like, man, I feel like it's like watching a Bill Belichick game in the NFL, and you're like, man, they are just loving grinding out things 3 points at a time right now. And I think they're going to need to have a little bit more of a killer's mentality this upcoming week against a Saskatchewan team that I think can open things up and be more explosive as an offense than Western can, because of the aerial asset to their offense.
Honestly, I think both teams have to clean up their game. If you look, both teams turned the ball over multiple times on Saturday. Both teams had multiple fumbles. Both teams, did not take care of the ball and put themselves in vulnerable positions. And if you look at the stat sheets, both teams pretty much did the same amount of damage. If you look at the stat sheets, you'd be surprised on how similar Saskatchewan and Laval actually played on Saturday in their national semifinal game. So I think heading into this game, both teams have a lot to clean up, specifically on the offensive end. I'm looking specifically at Arnaud Desjardins and his center. A lot of botched snaps, a lot of high snaps, right? And I'm looking same thing on the Saskatchewan side. Ball security, taking care of the ball. I think two great coach teams, two great head coaches in Flory and Constantine, they didn't play to their level of discipline during their national semifinal games. So looking to see how they can clean up those mistakes.
Well, we are drifting in to preview territory. So let's go right into the preview. And one of the things that the three of us talked about were potential storylines around the Vanier Cup, Saskatchewan and Laval. I'm going to throw it to Deshaun first. What are your leading storylines among this? And then I'm just going to sit back here, because this is the digital version, and let the two of you guys talk for a while about it.
Yeah, I think the biggest storyline I'm looking at first is the quarterback matchup that we have entering this game. We have the nation's top two quarterbacks, Arnaud Desjardins for the Laval Rouge et Or, and Mason Nyes for the Saskatchewan Huskies. Nyes probably might be the Heck Crichton Award winner, led the nation in passing yards, while Desjardins, who's probably a close runner-up for the RSEQ MVP, led the nation in passing touchdowns. I think this is as good as it gets if you're a fan of the quarterback position, seeing these two duel off against two great defenses with some weak secondaries, right? With some great receivers, right? So I think this is a game where you're going to see both these quarterbacks step up, target their receivers, and ultimately you're going to see just a great duel between these two. Also with Nyes, this is going to be his last game. So you have the potential to see one of the greatest players in Saskatchewan Huskies history, who might very well likely be the Heck Crichton Award winner, battle to end his career with a national championship. So seeing that quarterback duel is just a great storyline for me.
You're looking at passing, Deshaun. I'm looking at rushing, the ex-offensive lineman in the room, I guess. But, let's take a look at the Laval side. Kalenga Muganda puts up 173 yards rushing this past weekend against Western. And like I alluded to earlier, that's not something that we saw coming going into this game. And so the question now becomes, can Laval actually lean on their rushing attack to make some hay here? Saskatchewan, Malcolm Bussey was fairly effective against Saskatchewan, running for over 5 yards a carry, almost 6 against them. And that's St. Effects. That's not Laval, a offensive line factory, though they aren't necessarily pumping them out as much as they used to, but an offensive line factory, and one that just ran all over the Western Mustangs when they needed to. So it'll be interesting to see that. And then, of course, on the other side, you've got that two-headed attack at Saskatchewan that I think we'd be paying a lot more attention to on the whole if Western hadn't been what Western was this year. But now that they're out, we can freely talk about Riker Frank and Ted Kubongo, one of the best rushing attacks, two-headed rushing attacks in the country. You know, it was Frank that took the load this past weekend, but as we've seen throughout the Canada West season, Ted Kubongo can absolutely take over games, and he doesn't have to be on offense to do it. So, you know, those are two dynamic athletes that I'm watching pretty closely in this game as well, because let's not forget, Scott Flory, ex-longtime CFL offensive lineman, he's a guy that knows offensive line play too. They will know how to make life easy for their offensive linemen, and their offensive linemen will know what to do with that.
And even just queuing in on that, you know, storyline of the rushing game itself, looking at Saskatchewan's run game versus Laval's front seven. If there's any team in the country that is designed to stop the run, it is Laval. And we saw it last week when they were able to shut down Western's run game. Laval, they've only allowed 87.4 rushing yards per game all season long. They're third in the nation. And their linebacker, Alec Poirier, he might be the best linebacker in the country. So he had 17.5 tackles in the Mitchell Bowl, defensive MVP. Curious to see now how he can do in terms of trying to stop the run against Riker Frank and Ted Kubongo, which pound for pound might be one of the best 1-2 punches in the country, aside from what we saw in Western.
And I think, you know, on maybe a bit more of an off the field storyline, but, you know, is this Saskatchewan's over the top moment that returns them back to that glory that they held for so long under Brian Towers? You know, when they, let's not forget, when they transitioned from Towers to Scott Flory, you know, Jim, you and I were slightly critical of that move. And you know, Scott Flory has completely not just met, but exceeded any expectations that we had for him when he took this job. And all of a sudden, you know, he's built that program into something that his mentor would be very, very proud of, and that resembles some of the powerhouse teams that Saskatchewan has fielded in the past. Now, you know, Laval was, in the latter years of Towers' career, was when they were winning the Canada West, was that one program that consistently kind of got in the way. Well, this feels like it might be that moment where Saskatchewan's current program can finally get over the hump and put themselves back in that conversation and have us not necessarily just talking about the Westerns and Laval's as dynasties, but now all of a sudden starting to throw the D word around in a different sense for the University of Saskatchewan.
And I know you talked about being a former O-lineman. As a former receiver, I got to kind of drift things over back to the passing game. Laval receiver Kevin Maital, RCQ MVP. He is the best receiver in the nation right now. Had 58 receptions this season, 751 receiving yards, 12 touchdowns, and he's only in his second year. He is doing things that not even the Philpots were doing when they were in their prime. So I'm curious to see if Saskatchewan's secondary, was struggled immensely last week against St. FX, can shut down who is the receiver who is the best receiver in the nation. Can the Saskatchewan secondary shut down Kevin Maital, or will Kevin Maital cement what was essentially the perfect season for him?
Well, I mean, Maital is just, he's a fundamentally different player than the Philpots were, right? The Philpots were guys that were a bit more finesse players, excellent, outstanding ball skills, but Maital's more of like a bulldog type of receiver. He's got a good, thick, strong frame on him. You know, I mean, the Philpots did transition really well into the CFL, but the one thing I did hear from a few CFL sources going into the draft last year was they weren't sure if their frames were physically develop enough to hold up at the pro level right away. Now that's kind of been proven wrong, but that kind of goes to illustrate that, you know, that question is not going to be asked about Kevin Maital. If he were to come out this year, that question wouldn't be asked for him. And as we know, he's got a couple more years in front of him at this level. So he's a guy that I just love watching his style of play, because he can move, but he also, like I said, he's got that bulldog to him. To be honest with you, he kind of seems like a Saskatchewan style receiver stuck in a Rouge or a uniform. So I'm really looking forward to watching what he can put on the field too.
And this is a little bit off the field, but I know the Vanier Cup is sold out. But with the Western Mustangs not playing at home, will we actually see a full stadium on Saturday? I hope we do. But again, are the fans who might pay $20, $30 per ticket going to want to still go to this game and sit down in the cold for 2 to 3 hours and watch this football game and pack that stadium? I hope they do, because I think this is the best possible national championship game that we could have seen, that we could get. But the question is, will they do it? I hope so.
Well, and the question also is, those who do show up, who are they going to cheer for? Are they going to cheer for the team that you played in the Vanier Cup last year? Are they going to cheer for the team that you just lost to last weekend? That's quite the Sophie's choice for the Western Mustangs faithful this weekend.
Well, based upon being at the Grey Cup, I can tell you that a number of the Saskatchewan fans, because their team wasn't in it, they didn't show up. Those seats were sold. And a number of the fans there were also out of their seats. There must have been about 7,000 to 10,000 people at any time. They were out milling about, looking for a drink, looking for food out of their seats. So maybe there will be less intensity, shall we say, coming out of the 9,000 or so fans that have bought tickets for this event. I know there's a scramble going on right now for Saskatchewan fans that want to make the trip and Laval fans that want to make the trip. And I think there will be plenty of resale available online for those fans. Now it comes time for a prediction. You know, this has the potential to be a classic Vanier Cup when you take a look at this thing on paper. Who do you guys predict? Give me a score. We're rarely right with these things, but I will say in 2013, I actually guessed the score. Gord, I'll go to you first.
I think it's going to be tight throughout the afternoon. And I think, you know, calling it a potential classic, it's going to be a very well contested game, I think. But I just don't think it's going to have that fundamental chaos that we attach with a classic. I just don't think that these teams are really cut that way, but I'm going to say 26-23. I got Saskatchewan taking it.
You beat me to it. You beat me to it. You beat me to it. I think it's going to be a close game. I think, again, these are two very similar teams on paper. They statistically put up very similar numbers last week. And entering this game, they're going to be looking to solve some very similar problems on both sides of the ball. But I would love to see Mason Nias retire and end his career with a national championship, just given the resume that he has. And I also don't know how long Saskatchewan's window is going to be open for with this current group. With your leader graduating, other key pieces graduating, going away to the CFL draft, we don't know how long that window is going to be open for. Again, though, Saskatchewan, powerhouse province, so they'll always be able to recruit well, but we don't know how long that window is going to be open for. So I want to see Saskatchewan win this one. I'm going to say 23-25.
Okay, maybe I'm going to have to be the guy on the other side now because I was leaning towards Saskatchewan, so I'm going to play devil's advocate and pick Laval. You know, usually the easiest path to the Vanier Cup is going through the AUS. With Saskatchewan's travel issues, you know, and then having to plan and work back through Eastern Canada to the game, it's almost harder for them in a way to prepare because as you put out, Deshaun, on one of your posts on Persevere, Laval packed for 10 days. Laval was prepared to stay in London, Ontario, and they've been staging for this thing all along. So I'll lean to Laval, and I'll say Laval 22, Saskatchewan 19. There's a converted safety in there somewhere. Somebody's gonna surrender a safety intentionally. When we come back, somebody. I wonder who that'll be. When we come back, we'll take a look at a recap of the NCAA and Canadians in it. Time to look at our Canadians in the NCAA as we do every week. Usually it's at the start. Now it's in the middle in our 2-minute offense. Chase Brown was the star of the show with 29 carries for 140 yards and 2 trips to the painted end zone. But it wasn't enough for Illinois as they fall to Michigan by 2. Hakeem Messidor's sack total is up to 7. He had 2 of them against Clemson, but it was all Tigers against the U. Jonathan Sutherland had 4 tackles and half a TFL, and Theo Johnson was off the sheet in Penn State's domination of Rutgers. Mississauga's Nick Mardner chipping in with 2 receptions, as he usually does for Cincinnati, in their 20-point win over Temple. Montreal's Kevin Clarcias continues to produce 3 receptions for 35 yards. UConn goes down to Army, but they have bowl contention anyway. Another superlative day for Peterborough's Jared Wayne, 4 receptions, 93 yards and a tutty, as they needed it, squeaking out a 2-point win over Duke. Things just keep sagging in Syracuse. A 10-point loss, but Damian Alford had 57 yards receiving off of 2 grabs. Thomas Bertrand Udon with his biggest game for Delaware State in his career there. 28 carries for 139 yards and a TD. But they came up short to those Campbell Camels. So Chase Brown over the century mark again, got more yards than his counterpart Blake Corum on the other side of the ball for Michigan. Did not get the W and had to do it as usual with a whole lot more carries. What a workhorse he's been this year. Was it enough to maybe steer some votes for him in his direction when it comes to the running back of the year in the NCAA, Gord?
It's possible. And I mean, one of the things that helps is Blake Corum injured his knee in this game and didn't finish the game. So, the spotlight between that duo ended up shining purely on Chase Brown. And in a national feature game, he showed out and was, I think, after Corum left the field, was the best player on the field all around. It's too bad that, when Illinois has run into troubles this year, it's because their offense has unfortunately been too one-dimensional. Chase Brown is that dimension, but eventually that wasn't quite enough. As they got late into the fourth quarter, they had 2 separate possessions with a chance to ice it in this game, and they went 3 and out both times with Brown not being able to get going. Now, that wasn't his fault, but it did highlight some of the shortcomings there. The bigger thing, I think, unfortunately, that doesn't help Chase Brown this week, though, is that 2 other guys that I think are in that conversation for the Doak Walker Award also had excellent weeks. Mo Ibrahim at Minnesota was on right after that Illinois-Michigan game. He was fantastic again for the Gophers. And the biggest story of the weekend was Bijan Robinson, who hits pay dirt 4 times for Texas in their win over Kansas and really, really makes headlines and splash plays. So I got to be honest, unfortunately for Chase, despite his best efforts, I think Robinson just about sewed up the Doak Walker Award this past week because he put up a performance there that is just so completely beyond anything that Chase has been able to do this year because it was just so superlative.
Well, Gord, thank you for stealing my points. Really appreciate it. But I'm gonna have to agree with you. I don't think the matchup itself really did much to seal up the Doak Walker debate. As you said, one of the running backs got injured, and Brown did stand out to be the top player for Illinois the entire day. At the end of the day, though, he might have a chance to finish as a rushing champion, but I do think, as you said, the 2 candidates that also had spectacular weekends might be in that running alongside with him. So I don't think because of the injury that happened, it was enough to really sway any votes in that debate.
So where would Chase Brown land in our weekly Stateside 5? In at 5, it is Curtis Rourke from last week in one half of play. He was 12 of 16 for 169 and a TD, left the game with a knee injury, and unfortunately, he's gone for the rest of the year. The stopping machine, Malik Straker from Ottawa, Ontario, with 14 tackles for A-State. They did come up short against Texas State. Peterborough's Jared Wayne is in the 5. Another outstanding day. 4 receptions for 93 yards and a trip to the promised land. It is Chase Brown, another outstanding day and another big load for the guy. 29 carries for 140 and 2 major scores. Not a great year, not a great game for the U, but there is one guy who stood out. That's Akeem Messidor with 2 sacks and a quarterback hurry. He has 7 sacks on the year. NCAA games of the week. Let's throw it over to you, Gord.
It's the Egg Bowl, and even though Elijah Moore is not around anymore, this game usually promises high entertainment and often promises some crazy antics as well. It's the Battle of Mississippi, Ole Miss and Mississippi State. And for Ole Miss, as recently as 2 weeks ago, they were right in the thick of a potential college football playoff berth. But unfortunately, they've really slipped up the last couple of weeks. A lot losers of 2 straight, including a road loss at Arkansas last weekend, has taken them out of that picture and out of contention in the SEC West. But there's still some really interesting storylines floating around Tavius Robinson and his teammates at Ole Miss, as earlier this week, some rumors broke that Lane Kiffin, with a little bit of a resume behind him of floating around a little bit and and changing jobs to whatever suits his fancy. There's a rumor flying around that he was on the verge of taking the currently open job at Auburn. Now, it seems like a bit of a weird fit to me, to be honest with you, and Kiffin very quickly shot down that speculation. But that's been just an interesting added wrinkle for an Ole Miss team that really doesn't need any more to focus on than turning things around on the field. So they're going to hope to do that. Jackson Dart has really struggled the last couple weeks at quarterback. They're going to need him involved more. And as for our guy, Tavius Robinson, we've noted on this show in the past, he's got this knack for making game-changing plays, forcing turnovers. A big splash play like that against a rival would be a great weekend for him.
Yeah, and I'm going to take a look at the Pitt Panthers versus the Miami Hurricanes. And although there's no rumors related to coaching in this game, there's still a lot of high-stakes drama because Miami needs this win to become bowl eligible. I'm looking specifically at Ottawa defensive lineman Akeem Massador, who had 2 recent sacks in his recent game. And on the Pittsburgh side, I'm looking at receiver Jared Wynn, who's had a fantastic season in his recent game, had 93 receiving yards and 1 touchdown. Going to be a great matchup for both programs, but Miami needs this game if they want to become bowl eligible.
So for everyone here on Krown Gridiron Nation, I'm going to say let's get out to the game because right after this recording, I'm jumping on a plane and getting to the Vanier Cup. So I'll see you at the game.